Good afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. It is so good to see all of you. I feel like I haven't been here forever, so it's good to see all of my friends and guests here today. I'm Mo Wright, Chair of the Board of Trustees and President Renuka Consultant, and it's so good to see all of you back with us for another week of CMC. Today, CMC is proud to host the premiere of the 2016 Benchmarking Columbus study brought to us by Regionomics. Let's thank them for their support for this year's study. Funded by the Columbus Foundation and the research by the community research partners, the benchmarking report is a way we look at our community in a number of ways. This is the 6th edition of Benchmarking Columbus, the first one released in 2007, and it contrasts Columbus against 22 peer cities about things we're doing extremely well and areas that we can improve upon. This semi-annual report has become a touchstone and a catalyst for many conversations in our community about what we're doing great and how we can continue to do better. Let's get the conversation started. First, let's welcome Director of Community Research at the Columbus Foundation, Michael Wilkos. The Executive Director of Community Research Partners, Lynnette Cook. And our host today will be General Manager of WOSU Public Media, Tom Reiland. We are changing our format a bit today, where we'll also have 3 guest speakers representing specific topic areas of the economy, children, and poverty. They will step to the mics, our audience mics, a little later in the program, offer brief remarks, and also pose a question to the panelists. And there will, of course, always be time for audience Q&A. Our special guest regarding the economy is economist and CEO of Regionomics, Bill LaFayette. Bill's in the front. We have the Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund of Ohio, Renuka, Mayadev. And on the very important topic of poverty, we have President and CEO of HandsOn Central Ohio, Ernest Perry. Let's welcome all of our speakers. Tom, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Mo. First, to go off script a little bit, I want to get Doug Kreidler's autograph. Sorry to call you out, Doug. I apologize for this, but on the front of CEO magazine, large nonprofit CEO of the year. I was just really pleased that within the beautiful pictures inside, we did not see Greg in his bike shorts, which is really great. Certainly one of the many examples of the leadership of the Columbus Foundation advancing the greater good of our community is their support of this, the 6th edition of the Columbus Benchmarking Project. The entire report, by the way, is available right now online at the Foundation website or the CRP website. You have kind of a Cliff Notes in front of you right under your plate as you were eating right now. The idea is to benchmark against both similar and best-in-class communities while selecting from a broad framework with a focus on economic competitiveness. As with all our organizations, benchmarking done well over time can have many benefits, can focus our attention and our energies. For this report, we can see Columbus trends over the past 5 years for each indicator and how we rank this year among 22 cohorts. Now, that's a new number, 22. We're going to hear more about that. If you love charts and rankings, this report is for you. And as we delve into this report, you will learn more about what's behind these graphs and hopefully how to best interpret the benchmarks. So let's get into it. Community Research Partners is one of those organizational names that best describes quite well what the organization is all about. CRP is a great community asset, a local nonprofit research center with the mission of strengthening communities through data, information, and knowledge. We're very pleased to have Lynnette kick us off with an overview of the report. Lynnette?
Great, thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. Hope you all had a great holiday weekend. First, let me say thanks to the CMC for allowing us to be a part of today's conversation. We appreciate it. Many thanks as well to the Columbus Foundation for their leadership and forethought in commissioning this report. It's a combination of Doug Kreidler's leadership and vision for our community, Lisa Cordes' focus on supporting nonprofits, together with Michael's almost freakish love of data, that make this one of our favorite reports to work on.
I love you too.
I'm also very pleased to share the floor today with Tom, Ernest, Bill, and Renuka, and appreciate their willingness to bring your expertise to the conversation. Thank you to all three of you. I'd like to acknowledge Sarah Goodman, the Senior Research Associate at CRP, who served as project lead for this year's benchmarking report. Sarah, thank you so much for your hard work on this. And thanks too to the rest of the team standing there. Raise your hands, guys, and wave, proud that you work at CRP. There you go. The rest of the team who helped with this and all of our projects. Finally, there are members of CRP's Board of Trustees who are here today. Please raise your hand to my lovely board members. Thank you. I know that there are a lot of great nonprofit boards leading our community organizations, and I know that we have the best board of all. Okay. All right, so let me share a few details about this year's report. As Mo mentioned, the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Partnership began commissioning the Benchmarking Central Ohio report. The first report came out in 2007. The work started in late 2005 because there was some advisory board work to identify those initial communities and the initial indicators. Annual editions in 2007, 2008, and 2009 then transitioned to semi-annual reports in 2011 and not semi-annual, biannual reports in 2011 and 2013. So today's release of the 2016 benchmarking report therefore represents the 6th edition of this report. We began by comparing the Columbus MSA back in 2007 against 15 other metro areas on 91 different indicators, grouped into 5 different categories. This time we've kept the categories, which include population vitality, economic strength, that's community-wide, personal prosperity, lifelong learning, and community well-being. But we've increased the number of communities we compare ourselves to and decreased the number of indicators to make the report more manageable. So this time we compare Columbus against the original 15 plus 7 new ones, including Las Vegas, Nevada, Orlando, Florida, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Providence, Rhode Island, Sacramento, California, San Antonio, Texas, and San Jose, California. Most of the new MSAs were actually added for their similarity to the Columbus MSA, in particular as it relates to population size. Again, the number of indicators we've reduced from 91 to 56. Those we kept, we felt best reflect the category and have easily available or updated data. And it was literally the team at CRP who sat around in a room, because this is the sort of thing we do, and walked through every single indicator and argued the merits of each. This year we've also, to make it a little easier for you to read it, we've added some color coding to provide a bit of visual reference, and you'll see this when you download the full report. Midwestern cities are listed in red, southern cities are listed in blue, western cities are listed in green, and northeast is in black, although it's important to note there's only one northeast community included, and that's Providence. For our rankings, when you actually get a download of the full report, the best is always number 1, although mostly that's highest is best, but sometimes best is actually lowest, for example, with the poverty rate or unemployment. At your places, you should find a lovely, we've been referring to them as placemats, but hopefully you don't have too much salad dressing on them and you can take them home with you as a teaser. This includes a few slides visualizing the cities that we've included, as well as the 5 categories for the report, as well as 6 indicators that we pulled out to highlight. So while we think that those 5 categories that we've used all along are still appropriate, for today's conversation, Michael and I talked about really pulling out some buckets, and these buckets are pretty much based on the conversations that we're having with all of you throughout the community. So those buckets focus on children, poverty, and the overall economy, and now you see why we invited the great leaders that we did, Bill, Renuka, and Ernest, to join the conversation. Remember, though, that these one-pagers are simply meant to represent just a sampling of today's conversation. I encourage you to download a copy of the full report. It's not technically up on our website yet because I haven't hit publish yet because I wanted to wait until after the conversation, but we'll do that this afternoon. And I think the same is true for the Columbus Foundation. On our page, there's a scroll bar at the top, and I think it'll be the first scroll on the page, so you can get to it really easily. And while I personally would seriously love to talk you through each and every indicator, I think most of you would be asleep before I got through the first category, so I'm not going to do that. I'll just stop there for now and say that's kind of an overview, and I hope that you'll all download the full report and spend some time playing with the data.
Thanks, Lynnette. So, Michael, what are some of the top takeaways that you found interesting in this new research? Because you've been tracking it for many years, I know.
And, every day at the Columbus Foundation, we're constantly looking at different both primary research studies that we commission as well as secondary data sets that are regularly being released. But there were two really big surprises for me. One is kind of high level and one is going to be an indicator surprise that I've selected for this conversation. And the first would be is that because we've added 7 additional cities, for the first time we've been able to see that there are some significant regional differences on how cities across the country are really behaving on some of these indicators. And the one that I want to talk about is that there are significant disparities on gender and racial equity between Midwestern cities and those that are in the South and West. Originally we funded this study with support with Columbus Partnership, which really got this conversation going, but it's only now because we've been doing this report for so many years that we're starting to see trends over time, and because we've broadened the number of cities that we can see some of these trends. So let me start with the big surprise, and that is that Columbus is more like a city like Cleveland than we might expect. So when you look at the high growth markets of the Midwest, Indianapolis, Columbus, and Minneapolis, I would expect that our city would look different than Milwaukee and Cleveland, metropolitan regions that have had little or no growth. But in reality, we have the same kind of gender pay equity and disparity with regard to poverty rates through a racial equity lens than those no-growth markets. Let me explain that a little deeper. Because Columbus is a newer city, as is Minneapolis and Indianapolis, I would expect that we would have many benefits because much of our growth has occurred in the post-civil rights era. That's not necessarily true. So when I look at Orlando and Las Vegas and Austin, which actually have slightly higher poverty rates than Columbus, there's very little disparity between who's impacted by poverty, meaning whether you are white, Hispanic, or African American, the poverty rates in those markets are much closer through that racial equity lens, right? I would have expected a high growth market like Columbus to look like a high growth market in the West or South. Didn't really pan out that way. So that's a kind of a high-level regional difference. Another one of those differences is really about diversity. And there's been a lot of conversation in this community about Columbus being a very diverse community. And the rate of change here is very diverse. But now that we look at 23 cities, in fact, Columbus's diversity index ranked us in the bottom third. Yes, there's been a lot of change, and I would have expected Columbus to rank higher on a diversity index, specifically because we're comparing ourselves to second-tier markets, generally cities that have between 1.5 and 3 million people. Those markets that I would not have expected to see high racial diversity indexes. I expect that in Los Angeles, New York, and Miami, but not so much in the Jacksonvilles and San Antonios. And even within that second tier, Columbus's diversity index is quite low. We're changing, but we haven't even caught up to the racial diversity that currently is true for the United States. So those are two big takeaways for me at the moment.
Michael, are there benchmarks that you would particularly expect to see improvements in this report versus past reports, or do you think that some improvement is just not reflected in those reports in our community?
So I don't know that if the data is not reflected in the report, and we'll get into this a little bit later when Bill LaFayette comes up with some questions, and that's around poverty. The good news is that the poverty rate in metropolitan Columbus continues to drop, but it's dropping at a relatively slow rate. And it's not just what is the poverty rate, but who's affected by that rate of poverty, but given the rate of job growth in the region, and given the low unemployment, one might expect to see our poverty rate drop. That being said, there's also not a lot of difference between those that are kind of clustered, meaning of the 23 cities, 15 of those cities are with 1 percentage point north or south of where Columbus's current poverty rate is. So our poverty rate in this new report is at 14.2%, but for the national average, it's at 14.1. So again, we're right there in the national average, but I would have expected to see a little bit more movement given the strength of the economy in some of those other indicators.
Lynnette, as I looked at it, of course, you added a lot of metro areas. I want to ask you why you did that. But I also wanted to ask, because we added 2 more counties to the metro area of Columbus, and whether that skews at all the trends in the data.
It does so let me answer the first question first. So we added additional cities in part because those were cities that had the closest population number to the Columbus MSA, and we thought that broader look, how are other communities our size doing? You know, some folks like that we added additional cities. Other folks say, well, we don't have anything in common with LA, or we don't have anything in common with San Jose. Well, the reality is every community has that thing that it's known for. And really, if you're comparing across cities of the same size, you should be able to make some meaningful comparisons. So that's an important note. I do also want to just go back and say, remember though, this is not comparing the Columbus MSA to the rest of the country. This is specifically comparing us to 22 other communities. So what we've heard for the last couple of reports, I know you sneaky people out there are saying things like, well, we're number 14th in the country on this, or we're number 2 in the country on that. No, that's not what this is. We are ranked only compared to those other metropolitan areas that are included. So you'll see where the data are available. We have the top 100 MSA number, which is all the top 100 areas combined, but it is not accurate to say this is how we rank compared to other communities. And now I forget your second question. I'm sorry.
That's all right. We're going to go on to Ernest anyway.
There was one other change, though, because additional counties were added to the metro. I would have expected, given the huge back-to-the-city movement of urban housing in Columbus, which is happening all over our city, whether it's the Bridge Street project in Dublin or what's happening in the Short North or downtown Columbus, I would have expected to see Columbus's urban density index start to go up. But in fact, the urban index for the metropolitan region has not budged because we've added counties such as Hocking and Morrow and the additional county, Hocking, Morrow, and Knox, right? So yes, there is an urban movement in housing in Columbus, but when we continue to put transportation infrastructure, say with additional interchanges north of Polaris or the Lancaster bypass, it's making the geography of the Columbus metropolitan region bigger because there's now a larger land area where people are commuting into the city, and it's making it easier for them to commute into the city to find employment. So those additional counties are offsetting any growth in density in the urban core.
Let's go to our first expert question. Ernest Perry is head of HandsOn Central Ohio. Ernest?
Thanks, Tom. Many of us here today are aware that there's been a growing conversation in Columbus about poverty, even as we've seen some of the personal income indicators look very strong. What can we take away from the benchmarking report that helps us better understand poverty locally and how we compare to other metros?
So again, I'll give you the numbers. The poverty rate for metropolitan Columbus is 14.2%. We are right in line with national statistics on poverty. The more interesting question becomes, who's impacted by poverty and what is the geography of poverty? Franklin County in particular has a higher poverty rate than the metropolitan region because of demographic shifts within Franklin County. So as higher income households within our metropolitan region move to Delaware, Licking, or Fairfield counties, the replacement population tends to be new Americans, OSU students, or young individuals, and generally speaking, or people of color, all colors, and they tend to have a higher rate of poverty. So let me walk you through the difference in poverty rates by a racial equity lens for our community. And I will share with you that all of the Midwestern cities performed poorly on this index. So Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, and Cleveland all had very high disparities in poverty rate through a racial equity lens. I'll give one example. The poverty rate for white individuals in Minneapolis is 6%. But for African Americans, it's over 30%, right? That's a huge disparity. Yet, Austin, San Antonio, San Diego, and Orlando had far less racial disparity. So the question that would be a logical one to ask ourselves is it more important that our poverty rate drops by a couple percentage points, 0.1% or 0.5 percentage point, or is it more important that we begin to reduce the poverty rate through that racial equity lens?
So let me stop him for 1 second so he can breathe and give you some numbers. So in 2011, the poverty rate overall for the Columbus MSA was 15.4%. For the 2015 data, it's actually down to 14.2%, right? So improvement, that's what he was talking about. But the racial disparity, and Ernest, I think this is part of it, as we look at what does this mean locally. For whites in our community, the poverty rate is 10.6%. For Black or African American in this community, 29.1%. For Asians, it's 13.2%, and for the Hispanic community of any race, it is 24.5%. So it's that differential experience of poverty that's really, and I'm curious to know from your perspective in terms of the folks that are calling your organization for help, are you seeing that same disparity in terms of need?
Yeah, we are seeing similar trends in terms of the population, demographics, the episodes of people who have individual crises that are discrete, but they happen repeatedly, versus the number of people who maybe end up in a long-term, chronically impoverished situation. So I think the data that we're seeing on the individual level really does match some of what you described in the report.
Right, and one other indicator I want to just share quickly is around foreclosures. So we are tied for 14th place with Indianapolis at, this is 2013 data, and I suspect, I don't know if Michelle Heritage is in the room, but I suspect that it's probably worse now. 8.2% of mortgage holders in this community are, as of 2013 data, experiencing serious delinquency. That is above the top 100 MSA rate of 7.5%. In Columbus, 5% of mortgages currently are in foreclosure. The top is 1.3%, that's Austin. The bottom is, not surprisingly, 10% in Orlando. Just to give you a sense of how that poverty is then playing out. And one other point, if I may, real quick, is also thinking about annualized poverty, which is what the poverty rate presents, versus chronic or episodic poverty. So annualized poverty is how much money did you make over the last year. There is several series of longitudinal studies that the census has done, checking in with families every month over a 3-year period. And episodic poverty is defined as any 2 or more months in that 3-year period where a family is technically at poverty or below, versus chronic poverty, which is where they're at or below poverty for the entire period. So chronic poverty, from the latest set of data that I've seen, is at about 3%, where episodic poverty is 32.4, 32.6%. So there's also looking at those folks who sometimes are skating right around that level.
And because we like to share, the good and the bad, right? To again put that into perspective, for many places like Minneapolis and Milwaukee, a no-growth market, a high-growth market, the disparity in the poverty rate between white and African American was 25 percentage points. But in Orlando and Las Vegas, it was only 4 percentage points. But then we go from poverty to what we call the working poor, and that would be people who are at the 200% of the federal poverty line and below. Put that into context for a single person, that would be if you earn about $24,000 a year or less, you're considered the working poor, and we actually perform a little better. We're right in the middle of the pack, where those cities that have lower racial disparity, the Charlotte, San Antonios, Las Vegas, and Orlando, they have a much higher percentage of their metropolitan region that's in the working poor. Some of that might be a function of the kind of jobs that are in places like Orlando and Las Vegas, because they're service sector. So they may have better disparities or lower disparities, but they have a greater number of people who are working poor.
So let's move on to Renuka Mayadev. Renuka is with the Children's Defense Fund. Your question, Renuka?
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for the terrific report. So what really drew my interest as a child advocate in this report was the enrollment of pre-K children, so that's 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, in programs in Columbus. And what we found through what I learned from your report is that it's 43%, and we're very close to the bottom. I think we're 18 out of the peer group. And so what we know to be true, and the evidence has shown us, is that starting early is very important, and that we can have profound effects on an individual's life if we start early with our high-quality early childhood education. So it gave me pause. But I know it's complex through our work at the Children's Defense Fund. There are slots. I know you divided it up between public and private slots. We have, many of you know, the Head Start program is a federally funded program, so that's a public slot. We have private slots, if you see your primroses. Did you want to unpack the data a little bit to talk about the pre-K enrollment?
Sure, happily. So important to note for this, because this report is all secondary data. So this is ACS data, and this is adult household members reporting on where the kids are going to school. So this is self-report data. So it's really about, are you in school from pre-K up through high school and even secondary education towards getting a degree and ultimately being prepared to work. So these are self-report, basically parents saying, this is, my kid is enrolled in preschool. So that's important. For another project that we're doing, that we're just about to wrap up for Franklin County, we're doing a countywide youth needs assessment for birth to age 12. And in there we talk about the quality of the slots. And that is an important and yet completely separate data set around, it's not just about having slots for kids to enroll in early child care, it's about the quality of that. And you know better than I do about the implications and step up to quality, and is that the only way to measure it? Is that the best way to measure quality slots? How important is measuring quality versus just the number of slots and those sorts of things?
Yeah, and that's right, equality is very important. And we see that in the outcomes later in kindergarten and through education, that quality is shown. But I think it's important for folks to know that early childhood education is, yes, it's about those academic skills, that children are ready for school, that can literacy rates go up, academic outcomes are better, but there's also these soft skills, these skills that we call executive function, being able to sit still and listen like you all are here today, is part of being in early childhood education. Empathy, cooperation, some of the what we know makes adults very successful in life. And so the other thing that drew me in the report was the high school graduation rate. So we are doing really well compared to our peers on that indicator. So juxtaposed with that work that we need to do in pre-K enrollment, Michael, do you have any thoughts about those two indicators?
I do. One of the benefits of the 2013 benchmarking report is it really raised the community conversation about poverty in this community, because I think a lot of people were surprised by that, because in many ways, poverty is harder to see in Columbus because it is more geographically dispersed, right? And so there was a lot of people who got motivated by that 2013 report. Several community initiatives were started, and we can even look at United Way, which has changed its funding model to now be really focused on building pathways out of poverty for people because of that increased conversation and knowledge. Hopefully this report can do a similar thing around the fact that Columbus does not have enough of our children enrolled in pre-K education. We look at nearby Cincinnati, right? There's a lot of distraction in our most recent election of a few weeks ago. But one of the things that a lot of people, I don't think, saw in the press was that nearby Cincinnati had a public referendum that passed with 62% of the vote. It was the highest margin in an education levy victory in Cincinnati in 60 years, and that vote results in $48 million additional dollars every year in Cincinnati to increase access to high-quality child care slots. And Cincinnati and Columbus have about the same rate of children that are enrolled in that. So as we continue to unpack this with CRP and with my colleagues at the Columbus Foundation, we don't have to go very far to look at other communities that have already implemented strategies to improve that, because yes, pre-K enrollment and high school graduation rates are connected, and if we don't address this, we may see that high ranking slip in future reports.
Thank you, Renuka. Please know that after our next expert question, we'll have some time for anyone in the audience to ask their questions, so get lined up behind Bill. And remember the old CMC guidelines for this: no long editorializing in your question, get to the question. And speaking of questions, Bill LaFayette, our local economist.
Well, I am going to editorialize just a little bit. And
Not you, Bill.
I think what's important about this report and why it is so immensely valuable and so why I'm so grateful to the foundation for funding it is that it draws our attention to things that we wouldn't necessarily have thought of otherwise, like poverty and issues with serious economic consequences for our community. And so we focus on them and we can work on them. And as you look at the economic indicators in this report, and broadly speaking, most of them really are economic, there are some good things and some not so good things. But one of the good things that I found in particular is the ratio of the people coming into the labor force, just the age group that's supplying first-time workers relative to the population out of which people are retiring. And that for us was 1.11. So for every person leaving the labor force, at least at a population level, we have 1.11 coming in. Given our employment growth rate, which is much better than the national average, that's extremely important for us. And so that was one thing that struck me. I'd just be curious to get your comments on that and anything else that you saw.
Okay, so first I'm going to say I am not the person that decided that it was a good thing to have smaller numbers of old people. I'm getting a little bit sensitive to that myself, and I've had a number of people comment on that, so I just want to be clear about that. But yeah, as you mentioned, our ratio, so the entry workforce is 15 to 24-year-old, the exit workforce is 55 to 64, and doesn't that number seem way too low? Just saying. Anyway, so yes, we're at 1.11. Low performers on this indicator include Pittsburgh and Cleveland, who are at 0.8. So they actually have fewer people entering than they have exiting, which sort of gets you upside down pretty quickly. San Antonio and Austin are both doing really well at about 1.3. So just a little bit ahead of us on that one. And again, it is difficult and painful for me to say that having fewer older adults who are past working age or are retiring is a good thing, but from an economic perspective, that is actually a good thing. And I do think it fits with population growth. We're seeing great growth here, but we're seeing great growth among younger workers.
I think there's also, with everything, there's good and bad indicators in the data. So the unemployment rate in Columbus is low. We're producing a lot of jobs. When you look at the kind of jobs that are in Columbus, our top categories were professional and business services, government, and education and health services, which means typically the recessions come to Columbus later. They don't go as deep. The recoveries begin here sooner, and they tend to come back in a more robust way. But just because we have low unemployment and are producing a lot of jobs isn't really good enough. So I think that as Lynnette and I continue to unpack the report, we ask 25 more questions about each one of the indicators, right? Which is what the value is we hope it holds to everybody out in the audience today, right? And that is we need to ask additional questions. Where are those jobs? What are the skills that those jobs require? And is Columbus producing people that are ready for those jobs? Is there transportation connection to those jobs? Where is there affordable housing in relation to where those jobs are being created? Because it's not just about unemployment and job creation, because when you compare us to Cleveland and Cincinnati, and just doing post-recovery numbers, Columbus's employment base has grown by 16%, Cincinnati by 10%, and Cleveland by only 7%. So if you just looked at that measure, you're saying, hey, things are doing great here. But as a personal example, for neighbors of mine that live in Wyland Park, the jobs created at the Amazon facility on the Far East side of the city are very difficult for them to get to. So we're producing jobs, but if they're not accessible and if people don't have the skill sets to take those jobs, we have to be a little better at that.
Yeah, and it is the balance, because we're working on projects with the Create Columbus Commission, and we've had lots of conversations with the folks at the Columbus Collaboratory about being able to attract IT workers, millennial IT workers, and what can we do to attract them here and retain them. But then there's also the balance of making sure, as Michael pointed out, you're creating and maintaining jobs for the people who are already here as well. So it's a complex sort of thing.
Thank you, Bill. I have a quick question before, and line up. Anybody have questions, go ahead and line up. You know, we are number one, getting a little lighter here. We are number one in one thing. That's festivals and celebrations. That's a good thing.
But it also includes every single home OSU game in that inventory, so.
But there's a serious question behind that is there's not many benchmarks about arts and culture and the impact on a community, which has certainly increases economic activity and the vibrancy of a community. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, we were number one on festivals last time as well. One of the indicators that we had eliminated from last time to this time, I believe it was the number of cultural organizations, and we did not, it was interesting because we ranked really high on festivals, but not really well on the number of institutions or organizations in the community that are specifically focused to that. So I'm not sure what this festival thing is all
So
about.
we're in search of a metric that might
Yes.
reflect that?
To address that, yeah.
To address that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. First question, please state your name.
Hi there, I'm Andrea Applegate, president of Applegate Talent Strategies. I was surprised to see that we are below average in high-tech jobs. The conventional wisdom is, I think, that Columbus is a good place for higher skilled employment. And so I didn't know whether I was misunderstanding how this data was presented or if this is really revealing something that's new for us.
So are you looking at one of the indicators on here?
Yes, on the left-hand side, below average in.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So one thing to keep in mind is that Columbus is the highest ranked metropolitan region in the Midwest with high-tech jobs, but and this again speaks to the regional influences. So I think sometimes our impression of ourselves may be created because of our understanding of those cities that are surrounding Columbus. And absolutely, we were ranked number one for the Midwest cohort, but not so much when you started to compare us to the metropolitan regions in California and Texas. So some of it's just national relativity. That's one reaction I have to that question.
Yeah, so let me just sort of give you the presentation of the rest of the data for that. San Jose is at the top of that ranking at 4.41. Las Vegas, perhaps not surprisingly, is at the bottom at 0.43. And as Michael pointed out, most of our Midwest comparison cities, 5 of them are above us. Indianapolis is the highest out of the Midwest city. Yeah, I thought he was arguing with me. I'm used to him arguing with me, so, I was ready to take him on. Indianapolis, Kansas City, Minneapolis, and Pittsburgh and Chicago are all doing better from the Midwest cohort. Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Louisville are doing worse than us. So.
But there's also a clustering in the report where you see that the differences are not really that significant. So where the San Jose is the real outlier and a Las Vegas might be an outlier at the end, there's really a clustering there in the middle where Columbus is also located.
Yeah, and these data, we actually were having this conversation a little bit with Bill earlier today. We're going to go back and look at national averages for these data as well, not just the top 100 MSAs, because there's been so much interest in that particular indicator.
Next question.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Fox with the Pizzuti Companies. I thought it was interesting that you highlighted one of the measures where we're number 23 in the peer group, last in very small businesses. And I was curious if we have any insights into that, whether it's about availability of capital, or we just have lots of bigger employers, or what that might mean, and whether it's something we need to change.
And so to put in perspective, a very small business in this report were those employer firms that had 20 individuals or fewer. A small business is considered a business that has 500 employees or fewer. We performed a little better in that index. And then if you looked at the percentage of the total workforce that is in small firms, we performed a little better. One of the other indexes that you'll have to download the full report to see, is small business startups. And even though we're in the bottom tier, we didn't rank last place. I think we were 5th or 6th. So we're doing a little better in our growth rate than where we are on that. But I would also argue that as a state capital, like some of the other state capitals, there's a lot of people who work in government and healthcare, not necessarily lending itself to a lot of very small businesses. That being said, a number of the higher growth markets didn't perform very well on that indicator. That also surprised me because we have lots of conversations about those economies that are doing really well, have lots of small businesses, but also Indianapolis and I think Charlotte and a couple other high growth markets didn't do as well as we might have expected on that, but they still have strong economies. But that would be something that I think we have to pay attention to long term to make sure that the Columbus economy is as balanced as it could be.
And I would just add, and I know it's a lot of data, believe me, it's a lot of data even for us, and we're data geeks, but I would also add, though, that the trend, the very small establishment births per 1,000 trend is actually on the rise for us. So we had a low of 59.5 small business establishments per 1,000 in 2008, 2009, and we're now up to 70, almost 72 per 1,000. So it is, at least, for the very small businesses, at least trending upwards.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Next question. We have time for a couple more questions after this, so.
Hi, Sherry Cheney-Jones with Measurement Resources. Thank you so much for this great report. I can't wait to read it and download it. I'm curious, and I know you're going to have to unpack it a lot, and I will be studying it immensely. But what are the main takeaways? Well, for as the community leaders in this room, government officials in this room, like what should we be doing? What should we be working on?
So I have one takeaway, and that is, Lynnette said earlier, quit saying that we're 14th in the country because you're using this report, right? So be careful how you use data. A big takeaway is this is no single statistic in this report tells you the whole story, right? It's not just about what the poverty rate is in Columbus right now. It's the poverty rate over time. It's the poverty rate through a racial equity lens. And it's the geography of poverty, right? So one takeaway would be is you need to use this report, use the previous reports, and look at multiple different indicators so you can have a more complete narrative about this issue that you care about in the community. So that's one takeaway for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That was going to be my first one, but I'll let you have that one. The other takeaway for me is also, I think a lot of folks get hooked into a specific number, like that this number absolutely means this. And then what happens is they get upset when they look at the data, and that's not exactly, well, the data's not including this, or the data's not including that. It's that no single number is perfect, and that's okay. We're not saying that I can tell you exactly down to a T that there are this many families in this MSA experiencing whatever. Rather, we're saying this is a pretty reasonable ballpark, and this pretty reasonable ballpark for our community compared to the pretty reasonable ballpark for another community, and then taking that in the context of all the other pretty reasonable ballparks is where, for me, the conversation starts about what do we do about it.
And I'll give one last example of a takeaway. So again, I was very surprised to see those regional disparities with regard to poverty and income through that racial equity lens. Columbus is right there in the middle of the pack when I looked at the incomes of African American households compared to white counterparts. So middle of the pack. Should we be comfortable with that? The reality is African American households in this community only earn 58% of their white counterparts. But in the San Antonios and San Jose's, it's more like 79 and 83%, right? So middle of the pack isn't good enough, right? So the takeaway from this report is you should be asking yourself multiple additional questions, right? And wanting to get further, deeper into the research. This report collects a lot of information in a snapshot at one point in time to give us a non-biased comparison of how Columbus is doing. It's up to the community to take it and go deeper with it.
Thanks.
Next question.
I'm Amy Claiborne with Strategic Opportunities, and thank you very much, and this information has been very helpful. I want to pick up on what you're talking about with racial equity. The comparisons to other cities and the poverty rate, are you able to look at inclusive growth strategies in other cities And what does that look like? And is that part of the issue here? Because as we've seen in other reports, our community is very income segregated. And it's very hard to climb the income ladder when it's so segregated. So are you able to compare us to other cities in that way?
Well, so there's kind of two answers to that question, not surprisingly, coming from me. The first is, remember that this is secondary data that's captured, and we are intentionally looking at data that we can get for the entire country, so we're doing apples to apples comparisons. So the strategies, data around what strategies different communities are using is not the sort of thing that's included in this report, although I think that's a brilliant next step about whatever issues different folks in our community want to dive deeper on, then maybe we need to do, lit review case studies kind of things to get at that piece. I absolutely think that's great. But then the other thing and I'm forgetting now off the top of my head which indicator it is, but there's an indicator in the report that looks at the wage of folks who are at 80th percentile versus 20th percentile. And I believe the ratio for us is about 3.26, 3 point something. It's 3 point something. I'm looking at my team, and even Sarah's like, I don't know the exact number. Which means that folks who are at the 80th percentile are making 3 point something times as much as folks at the 20th percentile. So that's a pretty decent gap. And I certainly think that there's room for conversation about what, if anything, do we need to do to address that.
And very quickly, this report is not intended to answer all of those kinds of very complicated and nuanced issues in our community. But the Columbus Foundation and others have invested in recent studies on homelessness, opportunity youth, neighborhood revitalization, seniors, infant mortality. So this report should help galvanize clarity for people around what are some of the issues that we need to better understand and go a little deeper, do those lit reviews, understand. So the rate of women-owned business is increasing in Columbus, but we dropped in the ranking. So why were there 5 cities that are increasing female-owned businesses at a faster rate? What's going on in those communities? This report wasn't designed to answer that question, but that's a very important question for us to find out the answer to.
Thank you.
So I think we can squeeze in 2 more questions if we're quick about it. Go
I'll
ahead.
be as quick as possible. Andrew Dotson. My question is about this poverty through the racial lens and small business growth, or very small business existence or growth, and whether there's any correlation between those. If cities that have higher rates of very small business growth or higher numbers have smaller ratios of that disparity or not.
It's actually all over the place, depending on the community. So our minority-owned business as a percent of all businesses owned is 19%, and we're about just under 25% minority. So again, it's that point of we need to be more attractive to minority communities because then they will come and build businesses.
The disparity in Columbus between the percentage of our metropolitan region that is of a minority group and the percentage of metro businesses that are minority owned was a smaller gap than the cohort average. And again, that's not to say that we should be proud of not doing any work, but it was interesting that Columbus actually did fare a little better in that category.
Thank you.
Last question.
Sure. Hello, my name is Sean McKenzie. I'm with the Children's Defense Fund, so I feel like we're cheating a little bit because we already asked the questions. The question I have is in terms of the differences in disparity, especially, Michael, you mentioned the difference between us and in Orlando on gender and race equity. And so my question was, are there strategies that you guys have identified that help an organization start extracting out what accounts for some of the differences, or be able to kind of steal techniques and things from an Orlando or from another city who's outperforming us?
Well, we have an incredible resource right here in this community, which is Ohio State University's Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, which does a lot of great work on racial inclusion and racial bias. And for those of you that have not gone through that training, I would encourage you to do it. There are also some national organizations, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which has come to Columbus, particularly in our work around neighborhood revitalization, which has done some training through that racial equity lens, which is if equality is what you want to to achieve, what is the back map that you need to create to get there? Equality is very different than equity, and people need to understand that nuance because they are very different.
I guess the other thing that I would add, and this is not just to that last question, but to everything, we've had conversations internally. I know Columbus Foundation has had conversations internally, and Michael and I talk about data all the time, that we think that this may be the last year, or at least the report as a static entity that's just we printed or we give you a PDF. It may be time for an evolution there as well, so that people can do a little more digging and start to understand things as well. So interactive opportunities, I'm not sure. I don't think we know what the future may hold, but we are very aware that people want to dig a little bit deeper and understand these data more closely. And so we're having those conversations as well.
Mo?
Let's thank this panel today and all the speakers we heard from. Just to remind you, Michael Wilkos, Lynnette Cook, Bill LaFayette, Renuka, Mayadev, Ernest Perry, and to our host, Tom Reiland, wonderful job just starting the conversation today on what I know will be the beginning of so many other community conversations. To our sponsor, Regionomics, let's thank them for their support today. And we always invite you to stick around for coffee and cookies and continue the conversation today. Also know you can always re-air any of our forums through a number of channels, through Columbus Television, through WOSU, through PBS affiliates throughout the state, through the Ohio channel, and through our YouTube page via the CMC website. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow night and next week. Have a good week.